Welcome all. Despite the hockey game and the traffic and all these things, I think there are enough of us here now, we should start. So on behalf of the Mirhady family, I welcome you all. My name is David Mirhady. I teach in the Humanities Department at SFU. I need to remind you, or do I, that you need to turn your cell phones off so that they don't interrupt things this evening, or put them on silent, or whatever it is people do. I don't have one, so I don't really know. But in a few moments, Thomas Kuhn will come and introduce our speaker, but for now it's my job simply to introduce my new boss, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Jane Pulkingham. Jane, please.
Thank you, David. I want to begin just by acknowledging the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples on whose lands the SFU campuses reside in my welcome. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Kathryn Mirhady, members of the Mirhady family, and Dr. Kathryn Babayan, it's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the university to the 14th Annual Doctors Faridun and Kathryn Mirhady Endowed Lecture in Iranian Studies. Our distinguished visiting recipient of the Mirhady Endowed Lectureship this evening is Dr. Kathryn Babayan, Associate Professor of Iranian History and Culture and Director of the Armenian Studies Program at the University of Michigan. Her distinguished lecture this evening is the latest in over a decade of important lectures. Am I not sounding? Yeah, okay. I shall bring it closer and angle it. Is that better? Okay. So I will repeat that this is an introduction for, in case you didn't quite hear it, Kathryn Babayan, Dr. Kathryn Babayan, and her distinguished lecture this evening is the latest in over a decade of important lectures enabled by the Mirhady Endowment. These very diverse and exciting lectures have ranged in time from ancient Iran to the contemporary period, covering issues of epic and modern poetry, revolutions, gendered surgery, film, cosmopolitanism, political and literary nonconformity, Persian self-understanding, and transnationality, among other topics. I'm sure you join me in deep appreciation of Dr. Kathryn Mirhady and the late Dr. Faridun Mirhady for their generosity in creating the endowment that has made these lectures possible. Their generosity and that of many others in the Iranian community have laid the foundations to build up a quality core of programs in Iranian studies at Simon Fraser University. Persian language courses have been offered over the last 5 years. Our library continues to receive many gifts of important Farsi language lithographs and manuscripts. And we're teaching courses on Iranian history and Persian literature. Over the next few years, we hope to augment these existing courses to construct a program in Iranian studies at Simon Fraser University, which is founded on academic excellence and an engagement with the vibrant Iranian community in Vancouver and British Columbia. So I invite you all to participate in this vision of Iranian studies at Simon Fraser University. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Thomas Kuhn, one of the pillars of our Middle East and Muslim studies programs at the university and the coordinator of the Mirhady lecture since 2014. Thomas.
Thank you, Dr. Pulkingham. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure to echo your appreciation of the support of the Mirhady family and the Iranian community as we move to build a world-class program in Iranian studies. It has been a joy to see this gradually emerge over the last decade. But it is also a pleasure for me personally to thank the Mirhady family for permitting me to steward this lectureship and endowment as the successor to Dr. Daryl McLean, who has done such a marvelous job as the coordinator of the Mirhady Endowed Lecture from its inception in 2002 until 2013. I enjoy both the intellectual and community engagement that comes with this responsibility, and it's my great pleasure to be able to serve the lecture and the community, and I thank you for providing me with this opportunity. I would also like to thank all those who have helped me make this event possible. First and foremost, Dr. Daryl McLean, my predecessor, Tammy Tice, our History Department's Communications and Events Coordinator, thank you so much, and Mr. Adelan Rezamand, our graduate facilitator, and two of our MA students who have been wonderful in making this all happen. For our 14th Mirhady Endowed Lectureship, the committee decided to address the important topic of urban society in Iran during the 17th century and the role that cultural practices such as writing and collecting poetry and miniatures played in forging a distinctly urban identity in cities such as Isfahan, about which we are going to learn more shortly. It did not take us long to decide to invite Dr. Kathryn Babayan, Associate Professor of Iranian History and Culture and the Director of the Armenian Studies Program at the University of Michigan. Educated at Princeton University, Dr. Babayan is one of the foremost international experts on the multiple ways in which religion, politics, and society intersected in early modern Iran. Her influence is that of author, co-author and editor of over a dozen books, articles, and book chapters that have reshaped the way we think of Iran during the Safavid period. Dr. Babayan's work initially focused on new forms of mysticism and new notions of time, history, and royal authority that were elaborated under the Safavid rulers of the 16th and 17th centuries. Her first book, titled Mystics, Monarchs and Messiahs, Cultural Landscapes of Early Modern Iran, was published to critical acclaim by Harvard University Press in 2002. More recently, her research has shifted to the study of elites, gender, and sexuality, and especially literacy and urban identities in Safavid Iran. Her recent publications on these topics include Slaves of the Shah, New Elites of Safavid Iran, co-authored with Suzanne Babai, Ina Bagdian's McCabe, and Masouma Farhad, and Islamicate Sexualities, Translations Across Temporal Geographies of Desire, which she co-edited, by the way, with a former Mirhady speaker, Professor Afsaneh Najmabadi from Harvard. Dr. Babayan is currently working on a monograph titled The City as Anthology, Visualizing Cultures of Literacy in Early Modern Iran, important aspects of which she will present in a lecture tonight. Through her scholarship and breadth of vision, Dr. Babayan has laid before us the rich and textured history of the different practices through which mystics, chroniclers, poets, rulers, and courtiers in 16th and 17th century Iran encountered, understood, shaped, and remade their own world in new ways. Please join me in welcoming this year's distinguished Mirhady Endowed Lecturer, Dr. Kathryn Babayan.
Thank you. Okay, first let me see if I'm wired up, right? I have to turn it on. Okay, here we go. Thank you, Dr. Kuhn, for this very generous introduction. And I would also like to join you in thanking Ardalan Rezamand, as well as Tammy Tice, and all the other invisible hands that have made this trip to Vancouver and this lecture very seamless and very efficiently handled. So thank you very much. I'd like to also thank the audience who's here on a misty Friday or Thursday afternoon or evening. And in particular, I'd like to also thank old family friends, the Burumans, who are here in the audience as well, and it's been a fortuitous moment to be able to see them after so many years. So thank you for being here. And last but not least, I'd like to salute Kathryn and Fereydun Mirhady for the vision that they have, because I think that this idea of actually trying to promote Iranian studies, one way of doing it, to have a yearly lectureship, is definitely a visionary thought, and I really appreciate that. So thank you. It's an honor for me to be here and to be the 14th lecturer in the series, the Mirhady series. Okay, so tonight I'll be speaking to you about my book project. It's a project that I'm writing at the moment, which makes sense because I'm also thinking about writing and putting things on paper. So it's a book on literacy. And we have had very few works in Iranian history on literacy. We have 2 books in the print culture, so a time where from the 19th with lithographs and the 20th century, we have books in print. Nile Green is one of them, and just very recently we have Afshin Vejdani, who's written a book, somebody to consider actually for a Mirhady lecture in the future, but nobody has written about pre-print culture. What happens with manuscripts. And I think that Isfahan is a wonderful moment in time in the 17th century because it's a renaissance. It is a moment in time in Iranian history where you have both a cultural and a scientific renaissance. You have the production of manuscripts. And so what happens? How do we understand what literacy does? And when I'm talking about literacy, I'm also not only talking about being literate as far as literature is concerned or the word is concerned, but I'm also interested in visual literacy and the ways in which images and words come to create a certain kind of imagination. But I think what's also important is to think about cultures. How do cultures actually come to cultivate a taste for the visual? Not all cultures have that. I mean, some cultures are more inclined towards a certain kind of literary literacy, a lettrism, for instance, but not all cultures really have a sense of being educated in visual culture. And Iranians for sure do, and Isfahanis for sure in this period of time, as we'll see as a test case, come to be educated. And this is what I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about it. Like, how does it happen? How is this process of learning and acquiring a taste for the visual occur? I'm also interested as a social historian in the ways in which people outside of the court, outside of elite societies, act, think, experience their existence at the time. And since we don't have archives, we don't have state archives, we don't have city archives for the Safavid period, then it's more challenging to find other kinds of sources in order to be able to at least explore these channels of what people thought basically on the street. So this is another way of the sources that I'm using, as you'll see, to enter into, let's say, street life in Isfahan and imagine how street life was in Isfahan. Sefahan ra sawad husn didam, ze Shara Shoob tasvirash keshidam. I saw Isfahan as a fair copy of beauty. With the Shara Shoob, I drew its image, written by Ejaz Herati, a poet in around 1650 in Isfahan. So I think this line of poetry really encapsulates some of the questions that I'm interested in. Sawad today means literacy. But in the 17th century, sawad from the Arabic sawada just meant to blacken a piece of paper. In this case, to actually create a modern technology of a photocopy, a fair copy of Isfahan. And then Didam, to see, I saw Isfahan as a fair copy of beauty. How does one translate through sight beauty onto a piece of paper? And how does one use the Shara Shoob, which is a genre of poetry, to draw an image of Isfahan? Isfahan was designated the new capital of the Safavi Empire to inaugurate a second millennium of Muslim rule. It coincides with 1592, which is the 1000th year of the Hijrah, marking 1,000 years since the appearance of the Prophet Muhammad and his revelation of the Quran. It was an apocalyptic time when people truly believed in the world's impending end and in the imminence of the Mahdi, or the Messiah, and his message of justice. Associations with the divine kingdom on earth charged Isfahan with the promise of justice, bounty, and pleasure for all inhabitants of the Safavi realms who anticipated the appearance of the 12th male descendant, the Imam, from the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima and his paternal cousin Ali. Ever since the Mahdi's occultation in the 9th century, believers expected his return, and rulers drew on these sentiments of hope to communicate their political promise of a utopia. The founder of the Safavi Empire, Shah Ismail, took on the persona of the Mahdi and invited his audience to recognize Imam Ali as the gate of Islam. And I'm quoting, "For those who do not recognize Ali as truth, they are absolute unbelievers. They have no creed, no faith, and are not Muslims." Distributing land and booty, together with his disciples, the redhead Ghazelbash, they carved a Shia dominion from southeastern Anatolia, as you see here. So, is this going to work? No? Huh. Okay, so you see on top, actually, where you have both the Black Sea coming in from modern-day Turkey, where exactly we have all of these unfortunate violence against the Kurds by the Turkish government, into what is northern Azerbaijan and Armenia and Georgia, all the way through into Baluchistan, modern-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Uzbekistan. By then, the Safavi dynasty, 100 years later, after this Messiah claimed to be establishing justice on earth, not only the Safavi dynasty had secured their territorial frontiers between the Ottoman, Mughal, and Uzbek empires, they had forged descent from the Prophet Muhammad through Fatima and Ali. Such a sacred genealogy would sanction Safavi dominion over the first 12er Shia kingdom, and even made it possible for a male descendant of their own household to emerge as the hidden Imam. So as to prepare for the Mahdi's arrival, in the abode of kingship, Doul Saltaneh, a new imperial center was constructed, befitting the occasion. Isfahan had an old history, growing back to pre-Islamic times. In 1592, however, its renovation was designed to link the old city. Now, this is going to be a little bit more problematic because I would have liked to show you the old city. Is there any way that I can get the pointer fixed? Thank you. Thanks. So if you see, the mosque is on your southern side, and the bazaar we'll see more closely on the north. So it's the northwestern side, which was the old city, that gets completely reconfigured. Oh, thank you. Sorry, it's my fault. All right, so this whole area is the old city, and the city is reconfigured and recentered around this new square. So its renovation was designed to link the old city to a new axis that would become the site of an urban revolution in the function of outdoor space. The plan for a monumental rectangular square intended to regulate city life from the gate of the bustling bazaar, here, on the northern corner that directed movement towards the south, here, of the square, where a magnificent tiled portal of the First Friday Prayer Congregational Mosque stood inscribed with a famous saying from the Prophet, "I am the city of knowledge and Ali is its gate." Flanked by 2 minarets, this masterpiece of Safavi architecture was built to confirm the conversion to Shiism, the religion of the empire. The bazaar and the mosque, 2 lungs of a Muslim city, were separated by a vast open space bound by an arcade with 200 storefronts. Passing by a commanding, here, and we'll get a closer view of it, 5-story royal building at the entry of the palace complex, the spectator would face the golden dome of a private royal mosque that communicated the intimate relationship between politics and religion. At noon, prayer, artisans, merchants, and shoppers walked across 1,840 feet of public square, where the urban economy of piety, pleasure, and politics circulated through the new built environment under the gaze of the court and the mosque. Just for those who haven't been to Isfahan, 1,840 feet, if you've been to Venice, it's 7 times the size of the Piazza San Marco. It's huge. Visitors to Isfahan would have been struck not only by the traffic of people and the vibrant turquoise, lapis, and yellow tiles of domes, portals, minarets of mosques, and floral paintings on the walls of storefronts surrounding the square and the entry of the bazaar, but by the ubiquitous presence of writing. Epigraphy on the walls and domes of the mosques, firmans engraved in stone exempting barbers and bathhouse employees from taxes, visible at eye level to the urban community, created a particular effect of graphic legibility. The ever-present medium of writing cultivated a visual aesthetics and transmitted a form of urbane civility. Placed outside in open spaces, the prevailing public function of epigraphy was in dialogue with spectators as they walked through the city. This epigraphic program had a determining influence on a visual culture of a new use of monumental writing for conveying a political message through innovative aesthetic mediums of calligraphy and tile developed by artists in Isfahan. The use of a symbolic language of monumental writing was a visible instrument of communication that both spoke to a variety of levels of literacy. Graphic letters naming God, the Prophet Muhammad, and Imam Ali in geometric shapes became legible icons even for the unlettered. So right away you could tell you didn't really need to know the alphabet. There you go, Allah. Here you have Imam and you have Ali, and you have a repetition so that these become symbols that are recognizable to somebody who doesn't necessarily have sort of a literate knowledge. Verses in Arabic from the Quran and Persian poetry evoking the Garden of Paradise filled the spaces around the Royal Mosque and Square. This graphic phenomena blurred letters with figures, creating images that infused the urban space with symbols engraved on domes, on archways, and on walls of the central square. Carved in large calligraphic script high above the ground, they were fully exposed to the light of day as legible symbols of power. It is not surprising then that writing experienced a transformation beyond epigraphy and the medium of stone or ceramics onto the surface of a sheet of paper with the assemblage of a new kind of book, an anthology, either a majmu'a, and here these from the Arabic again, jama'a, to collect, to bring together, like the Friday prayer mosque. And here's just a sample from you that you see. There are thousands, actually, of these majmu'as from Isfahan. They're dated. We know that actually they're written on Isfahani paper. Paper was produced in Isfahan itself. And here is a very lucky one that I found that I'll be speaking about tomorrow, where you actually have a table of contents, because you don't have a table of contents. You just have to go and read through it, and their marginalia, and even like handwriting of other people, other owners, multiple owners. It gets passed on. It's a really interesting way to think about a history of writing and reading. And then a similar phenomena of the muraqqa, and raqqa is kind of a patchwork. This is a great, again, metaphor that I'm using in bringing together works of art. This was made actually in a royal atelier in Samarkand. It's earlier, but it was meant to educate artists. So you see that they're all of different shape. The horse, the best way, like the best painter who did the horse, or the flower. And you could see they're actually shaped so that the students would be around. It's a large format as well, would be around and would be then guided by the teacher himself. But one phenomena that you have in the 17th century in Isfahan is what we call single page paintings. So people, as you see here, it's a tailor. People had the power, the economic power, to actually commission, because paper was also cheap, painters to draw quick drafts of scenes, of daily scenes. They're like photographs of Isfahan from this period of time. Albums of calligraphy, painting, letters, essays, and poetry were produced not only at court, but in elite and merchant and probably artisanal household, as part of a cultured practice of adab or etiquette. This incitement of graphic expression in the privacy of household libraries gave way to new forms and uses of writing autonomous of monumental epigraphy. Writing the city of Isfahan as allegory of a spiritual journey to paradise was one popular subject recorded on paper, then copied and collected in many of these anthologies produced in Isfahan for private consumption. I started off with the line of poetry by Ijazeh Hirati. His bait tells us that it was through the poetic form of a Shara Shoob, literally through city disturbance, where he would visualize Isfahan for his audience. Inspired by the genre of Shara Shoob that narrated urban topographies of the bazaar through the figure of male beauty, Ijazeh Hirati draws on the poetics of the arts to craft his experience of Isfahan. Ashub signifies sedition, and in the medieval urban shahr poetics of the Shara Shoob, the bazaar was the voice of dissonance, a distinct public space beyond courtly circles and their poetic genres that were patronized. Though there is much scholarly debate about the particular characteristics of the Shara Shoob, in its earliest iteration, the bazaar is featured as an alternate social order. And so it is not surprising that a medieval poetess, Mahsati Ganjavi in the 12th century, chose the Shara Shoob to give voice to her rebellion. She drew on the poetics of eros and humor to write about young and beautiful men at work in the bazaar. Mahsati was linked to the Seljuk, a Turkic tribe that ruled in Iran in the 11th century. The Seljuk court of Sultan Sanjar in the city of Ganje in modern-day Azerbaijan. Breaking with courtly poetic forms of the romance of Masnavi, she picked the marketplace as her subject matter. Inserting herself into a male public sphere, she turned male beauty into a figure of sedition. Mahsati helped shape the Shara Shoob by foregrounding the bazaar as a site of disrupting social and gender order. From its nascent articulation, the Shara Shoob was already always about difference and sexual disturbance. By the early modern period, the genre of the Shara Shoob had been canonized as a masculine space for the expression of homoerotic desire. Typically, the apprentice craftsman's beauty was portrayed in verse, and the Shara Shoob deployed artisanal tools of production to represent the physical attributes of the artisan, as you see this blacksmith here. The apprentice embodied the craft. He was the figure of desire through which goods and services were mediated. The traffic of eros between client and artisan fashioned the aesthetics of desire, a masculine pleasure of trade and commerce in the city disturbance. By the time Ejaze Herati writes his Shara Shoob in the 17th century Isfahan, it had become popular to use this genre to write about the experience of the city of Isfahan. The body of the city, its physical sites of beauty and pleasure, were collected and organized through the lens of eros and humor to disturb the imperial image of the city of Isfahan, to fashion an alternative image of Isfahan. Here is just a folio, 2 folios from the Malik Library, from an anthology where I am going to be using this one Shara Shoob on Isfahan, just to give you a sense of the materiality itself of the text and how it gets recorded in multiple anthologies. Isfahan is both the city where Mir Muhammad Mansur Semnani, and we know very little about him. He's a poet. His father was a poet too in Isfahan. His name Mir, like Mirhady, indicates that they were descendants of Sayyid, so they were descendants of Imam Ali and Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. So Mir Muhammad Mansur Semnani, originally from Semnan, better known as Agha Mansur, composes his Shara Shoob, a site through which he represents a masculine space for a friend, lover, to learn about the urban rules of etiquette and love. Forlorn men are the audience invited to travel and observe and discover a cityscape of masculine and sensual pleasures. This guidebook simultaneously configures the rituals of urban masculinity to fashion a spectatorship of refined male gazes, just as it creates the city of Isfahan discursively. Before we take a tour of Isfahan with Agha Mansur, let me give you an overview and a bit of context with which to understand his guidebook. Agha Mansur refers to his Shara Shoob as a manual, Dasturul Amal, the choice of a conduct manual on love that disturbs the city of Isfahan has an ironic twist to it. Agha Mansur exercises the authority invested in a didactic manual, an educational manual, to expose the hypocrisy of court and mosque in their policing of proper public displays of masculinity. As a subversive act, Agha Mansur turns the agency of a manual into a Shara Shoob, a city disturbance, to fracture the order intended by former conduct manuals. Instead, he paints an alternative practice of masculinity in the urban setting of Isfahan, thus situating his manual in opposition to the modes of behavior being written out by the court and the religious administrators in Isfahan. Irony serves Agha Mansur's play on the promise of pleasure and abundance in apocalyptic Isfahan as foreshadowed by the Quran. The courtly culture of leisure, designed around gardens and tree-lined boulevards, allows Agha Mansur to expose the duplicity of celebrating homoeros at court just as it's being banned in the streets of Isfahan. His disturbing the city is not about taming masculinity in order to fashion a cultured courtier, but rather to cultivate male sensuality in public spaces as part of an urban culture and the social display of pleasure and desire. These contested and authoritative acts simultaneously make the city of Isfahan. Agha Mansour's language of love, ishq, that plays on the control and display of emotions as a malady of melancholy, soda, expressed in longing for God, the beloved, takes us into the ubiquitous realm of Sufism, so integral to the daily lives of Isfahanis. To be a Sufi meant that one had to come under the spell of love. And love was the language expressed in verse and prose through which intimacy was configured. Even as the ultimate purpose was to direct the Sufi disciple towards God in fraternal communities, it was to be achieved through a human guide, through a murshid. And so Sufism concerned itself with the disciplining of adab, or etiquette, an entire set of behaviors meant to regulate the carnal body and align the self through the intermediation of the Sufi master with the celestial order. In Isfahan, mystical registers of adab were being translated onto new urban forms of sociability, appropriating the emphasis on a spirit-body bond between lovers and beloveds and applying it to a wide-ranging performance of urbanity in the context of friendship, of coffee houses, of pleasure walks, and of literary salons. Men, whether craftsmen, merchants, courtiers, or travelers, lived much of their working life and leisure life in separate domestic and social spheres, cultivating intimate bonds that complemented familiar hierarchies in Isfahan's male networks. Influential Shi'i clerical members of the same urban community began to voice their mistrust of male sociability. Anxious of the erotic potential it could generate, they perceived such genial practices as obstructing procreation and moral probity. Agha Mansour draws on the common Sufi practice of gazing, nazar, to investigate the hidden meanings of Isfahan as an allegory for paradise. The etymology of the Persian noun nazar, derived from the Arabic nazara, to view, to eye, to look, to gaze, and to glance, but also to watch, to observe, to notice, to contemplate, and to consider. Nazar is the sight itself and the recording of the spectacle of Isfahan on paper, which involved insight, consideration, and discernment for Agha Mansour to generate his city poetics. The contemplative practice of nazar ignites carnal desire as the witness, beloved, is drawn to the object of desire. As you see here, it's very typical that you have in these single-page paintings an older Sufi who is contemplating and being tempted by a younger male with a bottle of wine. Here, the line of poetry is very clear. The green line, that it is a beautiful sign. And it took me a long time to figure out what the green line was, but if you actually see an adolescent youth, male, entering into adolescence and having the first stubble of his mustache, that looks green. And so that's a liminal point where then one enters into manhood and so can no longer be this object of gazing. And what is interesting is, of course, that whoever's put this together has made sure that there's a line that separates these two images that are also signed by the same painter and dated in Isfahan as well, so that this is really about abstention. It's about how desire gets shaped through sight, but the importance of actually abstention to remember God. This practice is appropriated by Agha Mansour to educate the senses into urbanity when the figure of the beloved becomes a sign for the social, allowing a new kind of visible masculine culture. The built environment and the spectacular events patronized by the court in the Nakhsh-e-Jahan Square served Agha Mansour as a mediator between the eye and the affective senses of the spectator, also associated with desire. Metaphors from the technology of writing and the physical environment are deployed to help visualize the city of Isfahan. Agha Mansour calls himself the scribe, the kotib, who turns the trees of the tree-lined boulevard, the Charbagh, into reed pens through reflection to write on a piece of paper, which is the Maidan. Writing requires tools, but also necessitates contemplative engagement with the urban setting. Agha Mansour's composition of his Shara Shoob provides him time to think about how to translate his surroundings onto a sheet of paper. I think we take it for granted that when people actually were first had paper and they could write on it, the kind of imagination it actually took and the kind of effects it had, because usually what poets would do would be that there were other people who'd walk around with their little anthologies and books and record their paintings, their poetry. But when you actually could compose your poetry on a piece of paper, it had something, as we see in his case, an effect on the metaphors that he comes to use in his writing. He engages the very organic matter present in Isfahan's ecosystem to capture the fabric of the city. To give you a sense just of the plan of the city, here is again that's the Naqsh Jahan. This is the old quarter, and here you have the Zoyanderud, the river that actually is a work of engineering to be able to then irrigate this whole space of trees along the tree-lined boulevard leading to the Naqsh Jahan, the central square. The author scribe uses the pen, he says, of the river, or the Zoyanderud, the life-giving river, to draw the central square. The Naqsh Jahan square is described as the surface of a page upon which the scribe uses his reed pen together with water to write on. His reference to the sheet of paper, which is liquid until it dries and solidifies, draws on his understanding of the mechanics of paper production itself. Agha Mansour describes the parallel processes of drawing water into the square to irrigate the tree-lined avenue that leads to the main square, together with paper making to compose his poetic imaginary of the city. Agha Mansour himself calls himself a spiritual prisoner, a zendani in the abode of misfortune, that Beitul Akhsan. His language of mourning for the beloved employs the poetics of mystical love poetry, or ghazals. As a lover, his pen name is Osher, he is trapped in the conventions of love, where both lover and beloved must remain in the state of separation and melancholy, for such is the practice of unrequited love. He is the abode of misfortune due to the absence of his beloved, eager to meet and experience his lover. He does not know with what tongue to articulate the intensity of his pain. How is he to represent his state? How to bring into utterance and materialize his emotions on paper? Agha Mansour's play on Sufi conventions is disrupted when he tells the reader that he intends to leave the state of separation. He says, "In what manner am I to illustrate and depict the reasons for leaving this abode of misfortune, leaving behind this feeling of longing and separation, to migrate?" He uses the term muhajirat to Isfahan. The reader expects a return to this melancholic refrain, but instead, as Agha Mansour writes about his agonizing stroll through the Chaharbagh gardens for a beloved separated from his lover, he translates that longing into union, turning away from the traditional garden metaphor to reflect on the urban space of the city. For Agha Mansour, the garden is eclipsed for the fulfillment of union and pleasure in Isfahan itself. The garden remains a nostalgic trace of the city in his city disturbance. But the city of Isfahan is the new site for the lonely to experience sensual and physical love and desire, a material rendering of love that breaks with mystical temporality of divine union, thus creating a space for the unfolding of the self to emerge in the urban setting of Isfahan. Once the author has voiced his complaint about the state of separation from his beloved and his anticipation of union in Isfahan, it is the pen of articulation that composes his city manual. With pen and ink and paper, he folds his vision into the vehicle of a manual and says, "In no manner may they, the inhabitants," and this is where he's humorous, "they must act according to his order," to this dastur. The desire of this heart, the author, is such that a passionate order be written about the healing qualities of every chapter of Isfahan. Traveling through Isfahan becomes a universal command and a cure for the suffering heart, which can be read and experienced as a book. Moving from one chapter to another, the visitor walks through the lively neighborhoods and attractions of Isfahan. So here is from the mosque, overlooking into the bazaar. He takes us right into the bazaar in the morning. Agha Mansour's tour of Isfahan, and I think you should also imagine at the time, all of these whitewashed walls were painted, so that even the imagination really of paint, all the images of paradise from the Quran are painted all along these arcades. Agha Mansour's tour of Isfahan begins at dawn, on the northeastern corner of the central square. As the sun rises, the agile-handed master craftsman, God, he said, lifts the morning gate of the eastern stall, warming the entire marketplace thanks to the mirror seller of the brilliant bazaar. The bazaar symbolizes the shining mirror, a mystical metaphor for the reflection of the self that comes into sight through divine beauty. The surface of the mirror is a space of reflection, just like the sheet of paper on which the author writes. A witnessing between viewer and subject activates desire to effect insight and union. Traveling through the bazaar, as he says, becomes a spiritual journey, and he commands his traveler to wear their pilgrim's garb and to begin their journey. Agha Mansour guides his reader first to the best coffee houses, tobacco stalls, bakers, halwa makers, and of course the most stunning male beauties of the city. Naming them all, he lays out a prescribed order of performing the rites of masculinity in the city of Isfahan. The first two stops of his city tour set the tone of the manual's transgression. To pay a first morning visit to the tobacco stall is a must. Here we have one of these single-page paintings where we have an archer who wants to pose with his hookah. In order to heighten the feeling of intoxication, it is in the small bazaar, he says, of the tobacco vendor, where morning pleasure is to be sought. At the sweet, delightful stall of the tobacco vendor, a puff of tobacco hits the tumult of intoxication due to the separation again from the beloved. If your heart desires to unite with the beautiful ones, do not miss the stall of the angel-faced beauty. Thanks to his face, your sense of separation will be further pronounced. Again, he teases us. He says, you can go, you can have your tobacco, but resist. After an early morning smoke, the traveler then must pay a visit to the stall of the infidel Armenian boy, Dokone Kafar Bachegane Armani. Their look will conquer your hearts with the art of magic. Their friendship is the enemy of your life. Though Agha Mansour's heart turns to dust on account of the Armenian idol, he shares a piece of advice. Whenever you place your foot in the circle of love, you must forget shame, name, fidelity, and Islam. Once you embark on love, be like a mirror and take on the color of the other. Acquaint yourself with the 72 religious sects. The number 72 is just a symbolic number. At times, be a Christian. At others, a devout Muslim, a Sufi, or a wandering dervish. Choose from every creed, for once you enter the religion of love, mazhab-e-ishq, you will benefit from love's fortune in the hereafter. The confessional lines being drawn by the imperial project with the construction of separate quarters in Isfahan of Armenians, Zoroastrians, and Jews living in Isfahan, here in Agha Mansur's Shara Shoob, they mingle together in the erotic trade and commerce of the bazaar. It is with this word of advice on the religion of love that Agha Mansur declares, enter the Grand Bazaar with the intention of buying the beauty of Joseph. Strolling through the stalls of the bazaar, Agha Mansur begins to educate his male readership in the aesthetics of commerce to distinguish the value of commodities with a cultivation of the senses. He instructs the traveler to first take on his setting. Look around you, observe your surroundings, look at your left, look at your right, so as to pass through the bazaar of melancholy. Just as the senses are to recognize and appreciate the delights of the bazaar, Agha Mansur's reoccurring humorous, ironic refrain warns the reader not to fall prey to the pretty male youths. The tensions between desire and abstention is what creates perception, even as it is not acted upon. It is the secret that needs to be concealed, at least for the moment. He goes on to describe all of the different kinds of vendors in the bazaar. The jewelry seller, for example, he says, adorned his stall with emeralds, rubies, pearls, and each of them embodying the attributes of the seller. His eyes, his lips, his complexion, his forehead are teeth, and teeth are onyx, are emeralds, are rubies and pearls. The consumption of goods and services on sale in the marketplace is again part of this education of the senses. To drink a cup of taghleb that is sweeter than the syrup of sugar candy and blackberries educates the palate of the male lover to the flavor of sweetness. There is no getting close to union by the stall of the sherbet seller. Drink however much you are capable of, and with the excuse of drinking sherbet, you will sweeten your palate of the heart. Sight and taste work in tandem to activate the senses. Every breath mixes the gaze, nezare, of the gulp of the sherbet with the meeting of the friend. The sight of the sweet sherbet nurtures the pleasures of seeing the beloved. To further enhance the palate, Agha Mansur guides the reader from the Qaysariye to the Karvansaray of the Yazdis and the Kashis in the north and in the south. This road, he says, leads the traveler to a small bazaar of Mullah Abdullah, who will sweeten the sense of separation with halwa. Agha Mansur maps Isfahan and animates the streets and buildings with names of vendors, their choice of goods that they sell. He even conjures up the paper with which halwa is wrapped in. Here, the ephemeral love letter ends up being used as wrapping paper for halwa. No matter what the reed pen of the sugar cane and the letter written on paper, name kagaz will turn into, it will turn into halwa. Paper was a precious commodity even though it was produced in Isfahan, and it was recycled for multiple purposes. Poets often lament that letters addressed to their beloveds are not collected as tokens of love. Instead, they are used to wrap halwa or sugar cones or to make paper kites for children to fly. From the taste of sugar that is likened to speech, so flavorful for the lover's palate, cultivating a taste for coffee was really another city must. Mansur takes his reader at the time to coffee houses, where coffee houses were the craze in Isfahan, and a wide-ranging men from different walks of life frequented them. It was a place where one could tune into the latest gossip and news. One could hear poets recite their compositions and storytellers perform the epic romances like the Shahnameh. Mullahs and dervishes gave speeches and moral lessons while customers sipped and smoked from hookahs, chatting and playing chess. For Agha Mansur, however, the coffee house was a place to render the spirit of the friend joyous. He directs the reader towards his choice of the best coffee house in town, which he names the idol house of Mirza Mullah's coffee house. There, coffee is accompanied by male beauties. Spend a couple of hours watching the picture gallery, Negorestan, and experience the melancholy of that flower garden. What great companionship it is in reality. The reader is to imagine Mirza Mullah's coffee house as an art gallery, where the customer can observe a spectacular staff, a place where beauties are on display. Agha Mansour's reference to a picture gallery is a poetic genre that evokes Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, who figures in Persian poetry as the master painter because of his illustrated book, the Arjang, composed to accompany his cosmological teachings. From the image acts of the face of that singular beloved, the picture gallery of China has turned into a coffee house. Mani was to have learned to paint from the Chinese, who were considered the masters of the art of painting. In fact, Chinese ideals of beauty, from the shape of the eyes to the white complexion of moon-faced youths, are archetypes in Persian literary and visual arts. To model the visual arts, Agha Mansour associates each male attendant with a spring flower, as you see in these single-page paintings as well, from the narcissus to the jasmine to the daffodil. Each scent and color of the flowers enhances the sense of the viewer. Collectively, they display an array of blossoms in the spectacular garden of the coffee house. They give pleasure, he says, to the calm, to the palate of desire. And I'm quoting, in playfulness, bantering, and coquetry, one lovelier than the other, well-built and tall, each one ready to be desired. Everywhere, two eyes, looking like foreigners, Farangis, and the middle one you'll see has a foreign hat, which was also a trend amongst some of these male youth. Inebriated, dancing, stamping their feet, all those angel-like bodies with narrow waistlines, these beauties are heart stealers. The art of boy gazing was a ritual of male bonding in urban spaces. Like Mirza Mullah's coffee house. In private, bureaucrats, artisans, and craftsmen collected portraits of coy male youth as mimetic tools that nurtured their taste for male beauty. Hundreds of such portraits were commissioned in Isfahan during the 17th century. Today, they are housed in museums and libraries throughout the world. Individual patrons in Isfahan had commissioned some, and others were collected in household anthologies. And Agha Mansour's description, because in the beginning when I would see all these male beauties, it was difficult to see, how are they used? What is the audience for this? What is the purpose actually for commissioning such paintings? But Agha Mansour's description here really helped me think that this was something about a mannerism that one held, similar to photography, how to be an urbane male, how you had to hold and comport yourself. What were the symbols that you would hold in your hand, like your hat or a narcissist? Agha Mansour's description of the coffee houses and the practice of male gazing links the ritual with the production and collection of portraits of youths, holding a cup of coffee, a jug of wine, or a flower. These were works of arts, the material objects, the gestures, the gazers, and the poses that men had to embody and recognize as symbols of sensual delight to act out their masculinity. To develop a taste for male youth, men had to also come along with the protocols of gazing and be circumscribed with taboos associated with this practice. The act of repentance was part of a masculine performance of piety, and the mosque was a space for such reckonings. There's a close-up. Agha Mansour voices his guilt for the first time as his reader is called to prayer. I'm quoting, "From the bazaar with the bloodied sight of the beloved and a heart concerned about judgment, dil afkar be qazay nigaran, he begins to weep at the gate of the Friday prayer. And he enters into the Friday prayer mosque that Shah Abbas built. He's not very impressed by it, so that it also tells you that this new plan and program that the Shah and the clerics had didn't quite work, because he actually takes us around and says, you can stay there for a little bit, I'm too much under the scrutiny of the imam in the mosque. And he takes us then here to the older area, and I will guide you to these two monuments and mosques that you see through the bazaar, which links the Maidan to the old quarter of the city. The performance of Piety during Friday noon prayer does not end for him at the congregational prayer built by the patron king of Isfahan. Agha Mansour directs the reader to tie their pilgrim's garb and seek refuge in sacred sanctuaries of the old city. The traveler is advised to make his way through the bazaar and enter the medieval city. He may be tempted again to commit unlawful acts with those flowered beauties on display, but he should resist and enter into this region of the Harun Vilayat, which, let me take you there. This old mosque here of the Harun Vilayat, that is actually named after Aaron, who is, do I have it here? Who is actually the brother of Moses, the prophet in the Quran as well. And this was an old area where apparently both Zoroastrians and Armenians and Jews used to pray. So he takes us actually to a space where there are older communal bonds, and there is a living memory of practices of different confessions in Isfahan going to, he says. And then he takes us, his most preferred space is the oldest Masjid al-Atiq in Isfahan itself. And it's an old mosque that has had its origins in the early Islamic era with the settlement of the Arab tribes in the 8th century. And it's a mosque that has actually experienced several transformations in the 11th and 13th century, where you actually have both a section where Nizam al-Mulk, the Seljuk Grand Vizier, has inscribed himself in, and the Ilkhanid, the Mongols, who also build on this old mosque. He talks about its beauty, its zeal, and its honor that remind him of the holy city of Jerusalem. And he writes about its charms and its religious benefits, from its physical attributes to its ancient water, from the Sayyids, the Mirs, descendants of Ali and Fatima, who actually work and worship there. And then, so from these three different mosques, as an act of piety, he takes us to a Sufi cloister. And he takes us into a Sufi cloister he even names Malek, Khanaqah Malek, which doesn't exist today in Isfahan, so I have no image of it. And there he says, in Malek's circle, pure Sufis with singular beliefs enshrine and encircle their peerless dervish. They have all complete intellect. There's a space, he says, where this is a space where sons of pure masters have assembled in ritual worship. Sufis, according to Agha Mansour, are bachelors of desire, celibates who spend their days and nights weeping at the door of the beloved. Their state is the translation of hidden love. In the mystic circle of the Master Malek, the language of love that Agha Mansour deploys in his Shara Shoob is visibly recognizable. A true Sufi opens his heart to the pain of longing. Experiencing love has little to do with the rational intellect for Agha Mansour, for the lover has to go beyond himself. Madness and bewilderment overcome him in the presence of his master Malek, who represents the beloved and God. Clearly, Agha Mansour's religion of love is akin to mystical love and friendship. But what is actually particular about his practice of love, however, is that it is performed beyond the frame of religious institutions, whether a mosque or a Sufi cloister. His religion of love models a way of being male and urbane across the cityscape of Isfahan. The ideal boy gazer is in fact far from being celibate, even as he has to discipline his body to enact desire. It is as though Agha Mansour has translated the aesthetics of mystic love into a material temporality that is part of an urban fabric of Isfahan. The body and the city are woven together in the aesthetics of the Shara Shoob. For him, both spiritual and carnal desire were not separated by the temporal worlds of heaven and earth. Agha Mansour maps the pilgrim's route through the familiar spaces and enters into, again, the Naqsh Jahan. Once you arrive, he says, at the Naqsh Jahan, take a moment again to absorb the entirety of the space so that it will come into view. Watch the tumult, shur qoqa, of the page of the square, Safei Maidan. All around you, the multitude of people congregated, this was early in the morning, there weren't many people there, resemble the heavenly spheres filled with stars and planets, which has the quality of the end of time, of resurrection, he says. With the sound of drums and the blowing of the trumpet, the square, due to the joyous clamor of people, is like the field of resurrection. In every corner, a performance, a muraqqa, and in every place, assemblies come into view. And his preferred muraqqa or performance is the wrestling troupe of Baba Qasim, the long-bearded beloved. Find an appropriate corner, he says, a place where you can see all the beauties walking in with elegant and well-proportioned bodies and pomp like lions. They will fill the space of sight for those with longing thoughts. Once the coquettish sweetheart enters the square with a fiery face and long braids, consciousness, hush, and ability, taqat, disappears amongst the crowd. Whoever so gazes upon his face, consciousness and patience distance itself from his heart. He bedazzles the heart with his coyness, with his colorful ways. His behavior is like a peacock, his black hair like two wings. His name, he says, is Hussein Ali. His skirt is a closed seal. The knowledge of Isfahan, produced by Agha Mansour, written on paper and collected in household anthologies, disturbs imperial imaginations of community and social order. In writing his experience, he transforms the genre of Shara Shoob, moving it beyond the bazaar to write about the entire city as he selects images of Isfahan's beauties, assembling them together to be read as a tour guide, as a book. The visual culture of Isfahan and the perspective of writing on paper brought into view opened up the city as a space of investigation. As the new imperial project built around the Naqsh Jahan created graphic legibility, it generated different urban imaginations. In the case of Agha Mansour's Shara Shoob, it is written out as a counterculture, as a form of resistance against a moral order being imposed on the inhabitants of Isfahan by the Safavi court and the Shi'i clerical establishment. Deploying a new form of immanent authority based on the vitality of embodied experiences, Agha Mansour's Shara Shoob is a literary experiment, a contestation that activates eros and humor to reimagine the city of power, the very symbol of transcendent authority. What is fascinating is that both Ejaz Herati and Agha Mansour's use of a Shara Shoob is to visualize that process and have the city be an image. Thus, he cultivates a visual aesthetics which required an act of witnessing, whether witnessing the face of the male youth, the epigraphy on the walls of Isfahan, or the paper upon which the poet composed his work. These curated objects are the material artifacts that stimulate reflection and insight. They are materially contingent models of cognition that allow the historian to enter into the private libraries of an individual's mind. The catalog of metaphors, like the pen or the piece of paper, make possible the construction of a mental reality patterned on the world of things that mattered for Isfahanis, at least for Agha Mansour and Ejaz Herati in 17th century Isfahan. Thank you. So I realized that maybe some of the explanations were complicated, so I hope you have questions to ask from me, because to translate something that I'm just working on that has a lot to do, of course, with conceptualizing how a mind works and visualizing that is tough. So please do ask me.
I think we have about 20 minutes for questions, and I would ask the audience to line up behind the two microphones in the aisles, and we will take questions alternating between the two. The floor is open.
Please.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. I have a question about your opinion on this whole tension about perhaps homosexual love that was described in Agha Mansour's narrative or travelogue, and it's also displayed not only by him but by various poets, the miniatures, all of that in the later interpretations, and because Persian doesn't have a male or a female third person, it became conveniently interpreted as the female beloved. To what extent do you think that this transformation into a more perhaps politically correct, conservative outlook of that, love is a byproduct of the Safavid and the clerical conservatism, as opposed to perhaps a more Western import into the Iranian culture? Because obviously from 19th century onward, Iranians were very desperately trying to emulate everything European, and by then the Victorian culture in the West was a far more, I would probably say, homophobic than the Persian culture of the time, but then the progressive Iranians now are much more homophobic than anyone in the West. So at what point
Hopefully
is homophobia?
the audience isn't.
To some extent, but at what point would you say that this was a Western import as opposed to an organically grown Iranian byproduct?
Great question. A couple of things I'd say first. I don't call it homosexual. It's homoerotic, right? Because homosexual is a category. It's a modern 19th century psychological category that is introduced really by psychoanalysts, right? And it becomes an identity. And so homoerotic, and I think, again, our modern selves are much more interested, or at least obsessed with sex. So I'm not sure that the one thing that I'm looking at is friendship, right? And so I think that there's a spectrum of emotions that doesn't necessarily have to be sexual, but the intimacy, what happens at this period of time is intimacy between men becomes scrutinized. There's anxiety around it. And the clerics definitely are the ones who are voicing it, because it's very popular. You have Shah Abbas with his beloved. It's a very pervasive aspect of, again, one has to think about, it's men who are in public, right? So that's why the urban experience of Isfahan is a male experience. Women could not go about easily walking around in the streets. So the city of Isfahan in the public arena has to be a male experience. So one thing that my colleague Afsaneh Najmabadi does is that with her book, Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards, places this anxiety in the late 19th and early 20th century. So what my work shows is that there's actually an earlier anxiousness around it. Whether it's successful or not, right, that's a whole different matter, because we have the Afghan invasions. It's really in the latter part of the 17th century where you have a very famous cleric, Muhammad Baqir Majlisi, who writes out fatwas, for instance, against male shaving their beards, right? That becomes a whole issue, shaving your beard, because there's this idea that if you shave your beard, you're actually delaying, khatt sabz, right? You're delaying your entry into manhood and into what you'd be a muhsina, right? So you take on the role of having a family and children and work as well. So it's a moment in time that it is being voiced. And of course, sexuality and creating male and female subjects has a lot to do with trying to control the population. So one thing that is happening in Isfahan in this period, where the mosque and the palace are working very much close in tandem. Under Shah Abbas, he had control over the religious clerics. But later on, the seminaries and the mosques really become much more dominant and powerful. And it's in that period where not only do you have an attempt, Muhammad Baqir Majlisi, for instance, writes manuals of proper behavior between man and woman, how a wife is supposed to act towards her husband. These become ways of both converting the population into Shiism, but also conversion means how you hold yourself, right? How you act, what you wear, whether you go out in public with your husband or not. So there's definitely a program there that's going on, so I don't think it's a Western thing, obviously, because the Western influence was not there. In fact, you have discussions that go on with French Carmelite missionaries, let's say, who are just as appalled by the male intimacy that's going on as, Muhammad Baqir Majlisi is, right? Thank you. Please.
You've talked about the development of an urban visual consumption, and I was wondering to what extent this is new. You seem to be implying this is new as people congregate in this cosmopolitan center,
right? And
so, I was wondering if there's any sources you're familiar with that show what the previous. If you could elaborate what was previously established, or what rural Safavid or nomad Safavid critiques of this urban culture.
Great question. So, look at the square. What other city do you know from the early modern period, actually, whereby both your religious, your commercial, as well as your royal institutions are centered around the square? Venice is the only other city. And so this concentration, I would say, right, of power, right, around one very delimited space is a unique phenomenon of Isfahan, and I would say of Venice. And so before, of course, you have, go to Istanbul, and you look at Istanbul, and you walk around, you have the Topkapi Palace, you have 6 or 7 different mosques of each of the sultan. They're spread around the whole city. There is no concentration, really, of both the visual imagery where those white walls are, for instance. I have historians, let's say, who are writing at the time, who talk about the manuscript of the Ajaib al-Qarayib, for instance, being of the wonders of the universe, being actually associated with the square itself. So my sense is, okay, Rome in the medieval period, it has a very similar kind of graphic sensibility, right? Because you do have writing throughout the walls and the cathedrals of the city of Rome. So those are the kinds of speculations, for sure, hopefully backed by enough material culture, where I think that this is something very unique that is going on here in Isfahan. And if one can talk about sort of the longevity of the kind of effect that it has, when you go to Isfahan, many families till today still, even though their sons or daughters may be architects or engineers, they will always train them in a trade, right? So that handwork, the importance of actually entering into the production of a craft is something very central to their culture. But I don't know, did I answer your question properly, or you're still not convinced? You should continue. If
you outlined something unique about this situation, or at least unique other than Venice. Venice. The second part was in terms of critiques or differences among rural elites or nomadic elites in the Safavid Empire.
Okay. So this is the first time where there is a move away from nomadic culture as far as the court is concerned, right? So the first, and that's actually, sorry, I didn't answer that part of it. It's actually really important too, because prior to that, you had Yeilagh and Rishlagh, summerings and winterings, right? And so the whole court would move in the summertime up north, and in the wintertime in the south as well. Here in Isfahan, the whole court, even the provincial administrators, have houses in Isfahan itself, and some of those houses actually are still existent. So it becomes a sedentarized court, which does make a difference. You're right, again, about this cultivation of a visual culture. But, again, I'm thinking about, so an elite household, a general's household, right? The general have, and we know that they patronized illustrated manuscripts. But that's, again, something that happens in a one elite household. Here, it becomes a democratization of space, right? In the sense that anybody who's walking into the street, right, who will then, their eye will be trained around this kind of graphic calligraphy, right? That's something that we don't have. It's a very new phenomenon that people can have access, that artisans can actually commission single-page paintings, right? A tailor. We have, I don't know, a man who gets married at a certain time. He asks a friend of his, he is a horse, he lives on the street of a horse weaver, for instance. He uses horse, I think, thread. So here again, that's like, why would somebody of that social class, right, actually commission a painting that will commemorate him and his wife's probably wedding?
Thank you.
No other questions?
Well, thanks so much. Such an interesting lecture. You talked about how this poetry actually illustrates nicely some bridging among minority communities within Isfahan. And of course, now we're a society in which minorities are everywhere. Right. And I'm interested in Isfahan's ability beyond this sort of literary work to accommodate minorities, and how the tradition of that continued on.
Thank you. Well, Isfahan was an old center for Jewish Iranians. So when the Arabs actually come to conquer Isfahan in the 8th century, we have several revolts, the Isabiya revolt, for instance, where there are, you would be familiar with them, they're millenarian revolts. So from the very early period, we know that we had a large, both Jewish population and Zoroastrian population. There are actually a lot of Zoroastrian fire temples as well in Isfahan, in Kashan, and further south as well in Yazd. So At this period of time, Armenians are brought in. So there's a forced migration of Armenians in around 1603 when there's a battle between the Safavids and the Ottomans on the Azerbaijani frontier. And Armenians were silk merchants and silk weavers. So there's basically a large population that's forced to move from the city of Julfa into the new city of Julfa across the river that I showed you. So there's a real consciousness, I think, by the designer, Shah Abbas, to make sure that all of these different communities have a space. Armenians apparently were also living in other areas as well. We have Jews who were part of the court, mostly doctors. So the hakims were doctors as well, so they had some way of social mobility. The coexistence, it's an interesting thing that it's really, again, with this period of time of a conservative reaction by the clerics, that there are forced conversions, and there is actually killing of populations of both Jews and Armenians as well. And my sense is that it really happens when, first of all, you have slaves who take over. That was one of the books that I wrote on. So you have Georgian and Armenian slaves who convert and become important members of the Safavi household. And in order for them to actually enforce or actually to show how Muslim they are, they engage in this kind of targeting of minority populations in Isfahan. So there's a reason, I think, around it as well, unfortunately. But today, when I went to Isfahan not long ago, well, for one, the Jewish population is more or less gone. So is the Zoroastrian, but the Armenian population, which the whole area of Julfa used to be, very thriving. There may be 50 families left, and so unfortunately, the physiognomy really of Iran for sure is changing, but the physiognomy of Isfahan has transformed as far as the multiplicity of confessional groups.
Okay. Guess I got you first. You mentioned that in the poetry there was the reference to the poet taking, the audience to the Sufi quarter, the
Yes.
Sufi area.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a, how do I put, was there in a way a attempt by a much more conservative culture to isolate these Sufi elements within Islam, and has that kind of maintained itself within Isfahan?
Mm-hmm. Great question too. Simultaneous to this kind of attack on the different confessional groups and on male homoeroticism, you do have an attack on Sufis, because it's Sufis that are considered to be, the dissenters, those clerics who are attacking them say that all they do is dance and drink wine and eat, and they don't really pray. And so there is the sense that this Sufi cloisters are these dens of homoerotic activities. So there are attacks, but in 1650, which is really the crux of where I'm working on, you still have many, many Sufi cloisters around. And Shah Abbas II, who was reigning at the time, was considered to be a Shah who was a Darwish Dust. So he liked dervishes, and so he himself patronizes a lot of Sufi cloisters. By the end of the period, again, it's the same Majlisi, the culprit of many of these. There are a series of attacks, again, circulating on paper around Isfahan against Sufis. And so it seems like the larger Sufi orders were closed down because there were too much of a rival against the Safavi authority, but there were these smaller Sufi orders that were plentiful in Isfahan also begin to attack. But with the Afghan invasion, maybe there was a blessing to that, the central authority is really disbanded. And until the Qajar period, you really don't have any centralization in Iran. Please.
In the description of Isfahan that you read and annotated, you emphasize the importance in their material culture of foreign products like tobacco and coffee, and just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that. To what extent Isfahanis saw their city as a cosmopolitan hub versus a sort of center that didn't need outsider help.
Well, I mentioned the Armenians. The one reason why the Armenians were brought in is that they had basically family networks of trade throughout the world. So into India, all the way into Java and Indonesia and Venice. And so silk was one of the main commodities that was being traded into Europe.
That was an important part of the self-perception.
Well, that was an important part of making money. I mean, there's something to the fact that how do you have such a rich economy? You have a rich economy because you have a very vibrant silk trade. And unlike India, both the Dutch East India Company tried to enter in and monopolize the trade, but the Armenians are too strong. And the thing is that the Shah, they're patronized by the Shah. So trade, of course, it's an entrepot from the south, from India, both by land, as well as the Indian Ocean. You have something like 128 caravansarais, places where merchants would go and spend the night and sell their goods. So the bazaar was a very thriving space that actually allowed then for the production of manuscripts, for the sale of single-page paintings as well. Thank you. Okay, I guess there is no other question.
There are no more questions. Thank you again for the fascinating talk.
Of course, thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you.